All right, let's dive into a pretty wild idea from our source material. What if our world was once home to giants, not just in stories or myths, but real, flesh and blood, colossal creatures? Thinking about that raises a really big question, a question of scale.
Seriously, just think about that for a second. Could our planet have actually been a land of giants? It's a huge question, so let's dig in and see what the source material suggests.
Okay, so first up on our tour of this ancient world, the evidence for what's called pre-flood gigantism. And I'm not talking about animals that were just a little bit bigger. No, we're talking about a world on a totally different scale. And believe it or not, the fossil record gives us some pretty mind-blowing clues.
Just look at these numbers. This is where it gets really wild. Take the Argentinosaurus, right? The source material estimates it was up to 15 times heavier than a modern elephant. 15! Or the Megalodon, 3 times longer than a great white shark. Even insects got in on the action. The Meganeura dragonfly was about 8 times larger than the ones we see buzzing around today. We're not talking about a small uptick here. This is a completely different blueprint for life.
So, the big question is, how? What kind of world could possibly support creatures this massive? Well, the source material lays out a few potential drivers. Imagine a planet with way more oxygen in the air, basically supercharging metabolisms. Picture a stable, warm, greenhouse-like climate all over the globe, with just massive, dense forests everywhere for food. And maybe, just maybe, ecosystems where there wasn't as much competition. You put all that together, and you've got the perfect recipe, the perfect incubator for life to get, well, giant.
Okay, so it wasn't just the extinct titans like dinosaurs and giant sharks that were different. The sources go on to suggest that even the animals we think we know, the ancestors of today's creatures, were a whole lot bigger back then. Now, it's worth pointing out that this part is based on model-based extrapolations, not digging up giant cat fossils, but the trend they suggest is fascinating.
And you can see that pattern laid out right here. The models point to this really consistent trend, whether you're talking about the ancestral kind for cats, dogs, sheep, or cattle. They were all estimated to be roughly double the mass of the animals we know today. It points to something systemic, an environment that just allowed or even encouraged bigger versions of pretty much everything.
To really hammer this home, let's just zero in on one example. Sheep. A modern domestic sheep, they're a decent size, but the pre-flood version, we're talking potentially up to 180 kilograms. That's almost 400 pounds. Seriously, try to picture a flock of sheep where each one is basically the size of a small bear. It changes everything, doesn't it?
So all of this leads to a huge, glaring logistical puzzle. I mean, if all the animals were giants, how in the world could Noah fit them all on the ark? It seems impossible, right? Well, this is where the source material gets into some really fascinating number crunching to try and solve it.
The starting point for the whole calculation is, of course, the blueprint laid out in Genesis. It says the ark was 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Okay, but what exactly is a cubit? That's the first thing we got to figure out to understand just how big this thing really was.
Well, using a pretty conservative estimate for what a cubit was, the total internal space comes out to this, a whopping 43,000 cubic meters. Now, I know that's just a big number and it's hard to visualize, so to put that into perspective,
think about this. That is the same amount of space you'd find in over 500 modern train cars designed to carry livestock. 500! So this wasn't just a big boat. We're talking about a vessel on an absolutely industrial scale.
And that brings us right back to the core problem, doesn't it? Okay, it's a huge ship, but if you're trying to load it up with giant-sized animals, was even that enough space?
This is where the proposed solution comes in. The model suggests a couple of key things. First, and this is a real game changer, what if Noah didn't take fully grown adults? What if he took juveniles? Young animals are way smaller and they need less food, less water, less everything. Second, the idea is that the ark didn't need every single species we have today, but rather the representative kinds, sort of the ancestral blueprints. When you factor all that in, the number of animals drops, their size drops, and suddenly you end up with a pretty manageable average space for each animal pair.
All right, so let's shift gears a little. It wasn't just about size in this ancient world. The source material also zooms in on a really profound physical change, a very specific transformation that happened to one particular animal, the serpents. So this table breaks down the idea of the serpent before and after the curse mentioned in Genesis. The inference here is a massive biological shift. Before, it's described as a subtle beast, and the model speculates it might have even had legs. But after?
Cursed, moving on its belly with a totally different limbless body plan. We're talking a fundamental change to its physical form and its place in the animal kingdom.
And the basis for this interpretation comes directly from this line in the text, "On your belly you shall go." Now, according to this view, that isn't just poetry or a metaphor. It's interpreted as the literal trigger for a biological change, a physical, morphological consequence.
Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. We've talked about a world of giant animals, and we've talked about a massive planet-altering event. This leads to the next logical question. Why did things change? Why did everything get so much smaller?
This right here is the integrated big picture, according to the source material. It connects all the dots. On one side, you have the pre-flood world. Stable climate, maybe more oxygen, giant animals, and incredibly long human lifespans. Then, on the other side, the post-flood world. Extreme climate shifts, less oxygen, and you see this gradual but definite reduction in animal size, plus a huge drop-off in how long people lived. The argument is that one directly caused the other. So let's just quickly recap the main takeaways from the source. First, gigantism isn't just fantasy. We see it in the fossil record. Second, the Ark's capacity puzzle could work mathematically if it was housing juvenile kinds, not full-grown adults. Third, the serpent's transformation is seen as a literal physical judgment. And finally, that huge environmental change after the flood is pointed to as the likely reason for the great shrinking of life.
And that really leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. The core idea here is that the environment is like a sculptor, shaping the life on a planet. So if a very different environment once shaped giants, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? As our own environment keeps changing, what is it shaping next?